Hey everyone, it's Dr. Ramani, and I sometimes love talking to you about the TV shows I've watched when I think they're relevant to what we talk about in this network. And it was summer, so I had a little bit more time to myself, so I actually got to catch up on my TV watching. And let me tell you what, I actually, for a minute, it took me a minute to get into it, but then it was an obsession. And I'm sure many of you have watched it, and might have even wondered, what was his story? Ripley. Now, any of you who haven't watched Ripley, yeah, I'm going to spoil it, but the movie it was based on and the book it was based on was very old, so you should know the story. It was a Netflix series. Now, some of you may be familiar with the talented Mr. Ripley, and I believe the novelist, I think her name is Patricia Goldsmith, who wrote the initial story that led to the talented Mr. Ripley that had Matt Damon and Jude Law and Gwyneth Paltrow in it. This Ripley was a shot in black and white, I think 8-episode series on Netflix. So good. First of all, any of you who care about film, it's beautiful to watch. But I thought, like, how are they going to take that 2-hour movie and turn it into 8 episodes? Unbelievably well. So any of you who watched it know that Tom Ripley is a guy who comes from very, very meager beginnings. He lives in a pretty sort of down and out way in New York City. And he somehow gets connected to, he was actually running like a grift, like a mail, like a mail scam. And it's set in a different era too. It's not in modern times. It's like in the I want to say probably the 1950s or 40s or 50s, because people were still taking boats to Europe and ships to Europe. And so he was like doing some scammy thing. For whatever reason, and this is, again, the story's told differently in the 8-part series than it was told in the initial film, okay? And so what ends up happening is the father of a guy named Richard Greenleaf, so the son's name is Richard Greenleaf, and his father wants someone to go to Europe and fetch his son to come back to the United States and run the family's big shipping business. The Greenleaf family is very, very rich. So somehow he finds Tom Ripley, who then, I think, almost agrees or claims that he knows Richard Greenleaf, who goes by Dickie. And so he then gets all his expenses paid. You got to remember, Tom Ripley's living close to the bone. He gets all his expenses paid, his travel paid. He gets to go on this big trip to Europe, okay? And he's been sent to Europe to go get Dickie Greenleaf, right? What the rest of the story that unfolds from that point is how Tom Ripley fully infiltrates Dickie Greenleaf's life. Dickie Greenleaf has a girlfriend who kind of lives down the street from him, but it seems like they're in a pretty committed relationship. She seems to kind of get a red flaggy vibe from Tom Ripley, but Tom Ripley, and we're going to talk about him in a moment, does all the things to kind of even take her off the trail and basically sets off to commit what one would argue is the perfect crime. This is where the spoilers come, folks. So if you want to watch Ripley and come back to this video, this might be the time you want to turn it off. So he subsequently kills Dickie and sets it up literally as the perfect crime, like the way he kills him on a boat, and the way he sinks the boat, and the way he creates his alibis. The way he does the crime, and so I'm not here to tell you the whole story, but it is what was Tom Ripley. And it'd be great if you dropped in the comments what you thought Tom Ripley was. Did you think he was narcissistic? If so, what kind? But I'm going to tell you, Tom Ripley was a great example of a cinematic psychopath. Full-on psychopath. I might give him a tiny sprinkle of narcissism. In fact, he's a great example of a dark tetrad person. Psychopathy, narcissism, Machiavellianism, and sadism. Because what Tom Ripley was going to do, because there was a bit of that kind of, I'm going to get mine, I'm sort of owed, which is as a vulnerable narcissist vibe, kind of a sociopathic vibe. But psychopathic people also have that sense of that the world owes them something. But the thing we notice with Tom Ripley's character, a lot of people say, like, really, like, what does a psychopath seem like? This was a great example of someone who could hide in plain sight. You wouldn't see strong emotion come from Tom Ripley. There was a real almost flatness to his emotion, and the guy who played him played Psychopath brilliantly. He wasn't scary. until you knew what was going on. Then he got scarier. But he wasn't ostensibly scary. In fact, there was something seemingly mild-mannered about him. He wasn't angry. He didn't get agitated, which are things we might more often see in a sociopathic person. But he stayed very, very even-keeled. And then he proceeded again to fully infiltrate. There's a real patience to how Tom Ripley took his time to fully infiltrate into that little Italian town that Dickie Greenleaf lived in, to infiltrate into Dickie Greenleaf's life. And here's the big psychopathic piece. He studied Dickie Greenleaf. It was that narcissistic-y, psychopathic emulation and mirroring. They learn mannerisms. They really learn everything about a person. One could argue that in his fashion, Tom Ripley was love-bombing Dickie Greenleaf because he was really almost trying to win him over, make him feel sort of indispensable to him, sort of a perfectly made friend kind of thing. And when people came into their world that were suspicious of Tom either found a way to throw them off the trail, as he did, for example, with Dickie's girlfriend, or kill more people, as he would end up doing with one of Dickie's friends. But it was Tom's capacity to fully emulate the fullness of Dickie that he ended up, and again, a not uncommon psychopathic play, he ended up assuming Dickie Greenleaf's character, his name. He made a false passport, all the grifty things, right? And so he was actually able to go through the world with almost no mistakes as Dickie Greenleaf, and was quite convincing. No one doubted him, and he knew how to sign something right. He practiced hundreds of times doing the signature, the mannerisms, the whole 9 yards. And the new people he'd meet, they didn't know who Dickie Greenleaf was, so they believed it because he had all the appropriate identification, all of that. All these details and all these things I'm sharing with you is the reason this show really struck me. Is so often when we see cinematic depictions of people, they're either sort of much more narcissistic or a lot more kind of menacing, that kind of scary person in a serial killer movie who certainly would qualify as being sort of psychopathic. But you're like, I would have seen this person coming a mile away. Like if I saw that person on a dark street, I would definitely have gotten off that dark street. But in a case of how they portrayed it in Ripley, it was such a perfect depiction of the psychopathic person. Because a few people got a whiff of him and were suspicious, and they actually played that really well in the film. But then the key character didn't, and many others did not. And he kept being able to move those goalposts further and further and further out until ultimately he did get away with it, which happened in both films. So if you saw the other one, you know he got away with it too. But I think it's really important to see sort of the regular person hiding in plain sight. I think we often have that conception of the psychopathic person. If they're not literally the person who has committed crimes and wound up in prison, then they might be sort of the conniving, evil Wall Street person with the slick back hair and the really expensive suit. And like, I'd see that coming too, bad finance guy kind of thing. But this was just actually a kind of a guy who had a down on his luck feel. Now, what was interesting was this was one of those cases where in Tom Ripley was not just the psychopathy, but this touch of vulnerable narcissism, a sort of victimhood that was born out of his rather less than lustrous beginnings. Because again, he came from nothing, and he saw an opportunity, and he jumped in it. And even before he came to Europe, he was again running a grift in the United States. But for those of you who have seen Ripley, it would be interesting for you to drop in the comments if you had a similar take. But I actually thought it was one of the better shown and really well drawn out and developed depictions of a psychopath I had seen, in the sense of the calmness, even when things would go wrong. And you'll see if you watch the movie and or the series, more than a few things went really, really wrong. And I think the thing that struck me in the series was how calm he stayed in the midst of what was really a mess at times when he was actively committing a murder. And so I think that paying attention to that and that calmness, for any of you who have had the much more unique experience of having been through a relationship with a psychopath, the reason I say it's unique is that the estimates of psychopathy in the population at best 1%. It's a relatively rare, thank goodness, condition compared to narcissism, which is probably in the closer to 8 to 10% range. So much greater likelihood that people have been in a narcissistic relationship than in a psychopathic relationship. If a person had a psychopathic parent, odds on favored are that that parent had left the system, maybe went to prison, just disappeared. They don't tend to stick around for long. And so for those reasons, many more of you will have had the narcissism experience. But for those of you who have had the psychopathy experience, you may often even feel unheard and unseen in a lot of the content around narcissism because your experience was so unusual and rare and destabilizing and frankly, damn terrifying. So anyhow, I don't work for Netflix, and I don't care if you watch Ripley, but if you enjoy a good psychopath story, Ripley might be one of the best ones I've ever seen. And again, it is really a splendor to watch. It is so, so well made. So give it a look and let me know if you agree with me. Thanks again.